At Ashdown House in Berkshire, if a servant walking up the stairs happened to encounter one of the family members coming down, the servant was required to stop immediately and turn to face the wall. No bow, no curtsy, no greeting. You simply pressed your face against the wallpaper and waited in silence until the sound of footsteps faded and you were alone again. And that wallpaper you were pressing your face against had a reasonable chance of slowly poisoning you to death. But we will get to that shortly. Welcome to life inside a Victorian manor in 1880. A world of extraordinary wealth, astonishing beauty, 14-course dinners, and a rigid social machine so finely calibrated that it could destroy your entire life over a card game. This is a world where fewer than 1,500 families controlled the social universe of an empire, whilst where 80% of the country's land belonged to just 7,000 people, and where the man who owned the house you lived in earned the modern equivalent of $1.2 million a year, while you, the person keeping his house running, took home roughly £25 annually. That translates to about $2,700 in today's money, for a full year of work, starting at 6 in the morning and ending, if you were lucky, around 10 at night. The popular imagination paints the Victorian manor as a place of elegance and refinement, and it was, if you happened to be born into the right family. For everyone else, and that means nearly everyone, the manor was a beautifully decorated machine designed to keep you invisible, silent, exhausted, and grateful for the privilege of all three. You would not have lasted a week. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why. Let's start with who actually lived in these places, because the numbers alone tell a story. In 1880, the true upper class of Britain, the people who owned country estates and moved through what was simply called society, numbered fewer than 1,500 families. These were the aristocracy and the substantial gentry, the dukes and marquises and earls and viscounts and barons. 431 hereditary members of the House of Lords sat at the top of this pyramid, and between them and a few thousand other landed families, they controlled approximately 80% of the acreage in the entire country. The Duke of Westminster employed around 50 indoor servants and another 50 outdoor servants. The 6th Duke of Portland kept roughly 300. Queen Victoria herself had about the same number, plus a separate staff of Indian cooks whose sole job was to prepare a curry lunch for her every single day. These families structured their entire year around the social season, which revolved around wherever the royal family happened to be. From April to July, and again from October to Christmas, the aristocracy descended on London. Then from August through December, they retreated to their country estates for house parties, pheasant shooting, and fox hunting. Every movement, every dinner, every visit was choreographed according to an unwritten code, so complex and so ruthlessly enforced that a single misstep could end your social existence permanently. And all of it, every last bit of it, ran on the backs of servants. Well, more Victorians worked in domestic service than in factories or on farms. It was the single largest employment sector in the country. According to the 1881 census, almost 1.6 million women worked in indoor domestic service alone, representing 35% of the entire working female population aged 10 and upwards. 10 years old. Women outnumbered men in service by 20 to 1, partly because male indoor servants carried a special tax, which meant only the truly wealthy bothered employing them. If you walked into a grand house and saw footmen lining the hallway, you were looking at a display of wealth as deliberate as the silver on the dining table. Those footmen, by the way, were specifically chosen for their height. Guests and employers preferred tall footmen. A particularly tall or good-looking footman could actually command a higher salary than the rest of the household staff, which is a hiring practice that makes modern employment law look positively enlightened. The hierarchy inside the house was absolute. At the top sat the butler, the most highly ranked servant, earning between £40 and £60 a year, responsible for running the entire household, hiring new staff, and overseeing every daily operation. Beside him stood the housekeeper, always female, always addressed as Mrs., regardless of whether she had ever been married, who managed all the female staff and maintained the furnishings. Below them, in the grandest houses, servants split into two worlds that barely interacted. The upper 10, which included the house steward, butler, housekeeper, chef, valet, and lady's maid, that enjoyed daily contact with the family. The lower 5, the under-butler, footman, housemaids, scullery maids, kitchen maids, laundry maids, coachmen, and hall boys, might never see or meet the family they served. They ate in the basement servants' hall. They slept in the attic. They moved through hidden corridors and back staircases specifically designed so the family would never have to lay eyes on them. And the rules governing their behavior read like a psychological experiment in erasure. Never let your voice be heard by the ladies and gentlemen of the house, except when necessary, and then as little as possible. Servants were forbidden from singing, forbidden from laughing, required to remain as noiseless and invisible as humanly possible. If they accidentally came face to face with a household member, or if they were expected to avert their eyes. At Ashdown House, as you already know, the instruction went even further. Turn and face the wall. No acknowledgement at all. You were furniture that breathed. If anything was broken or damaged, the cost was deducted directly from your wages, wages that already amounted to almost nothing. A housemaid in London earned between £10 and £25 a year. A general servant, known as a maid-of-all-work, earned between £6 and £15. A scullery maid, the lowest of the low, could start at just £5 a year. Mrs. Beeton herself, in her famous Book of Household Management, described the scullery maid as perhaps the only one of her class deserving of commiseration. Her life is a solitary one, and in some places, her work is never done. She is also subject to rougher treatment. That was not a reformer writing an exposé. That was a household management guide, stating it as simple fact. One former scullery maid, recorded decades later in an oral history archive, described her job, which included lugging enormous quantities of coal up flights of stairs to the many fireplaces of a large estate, as a form of slavery. She started her day before dawn and finished it in the dark, with hands cracked and raw from scrubbing, and knees swollen from hours spent on stone floors. That swelling had a medical name: prepatellar bursitis, inflammation from prolonged kneeling. It was so common among household servants that doctors simply called it housemaid's knee. The scullery maid hauled hot water from the boiling room to the baths upstairs, at each load weighing approximately 15 kilograms. She cleaned pots, scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, and did it all under the supervision of the cook, who could treat her however she pleased. In many houses, the scullery maid was not even called by her real name. She was simply called Mary, regardless of what her actual name was. A standardized label for a standardized human tool. A 16-year-old orphan, testifying in a Victorian inquiry, said, "When I was 10, I was sent to service as maid-of-all-work in a small tradesman's family. She was 10, and that was normal. Servants received half a day off on Sundays. Occasionally, if they were fortunate, they received a full day off in an entire month. The change to a full day off per week did not arrive until the 1900s, when it became fashionable. Not fair. Fashionable, where romance was essentially prohibited. The posted rules in many great houses stated it plainly. Followers are strictly forbidden, and any maid found fraternizing with a member of the opposite sex will be dismissed without a hearing. If servants fell in love, they typically had to leave service, usually without a character reference. which meant they could not find work anywhere else. For a disgraced female servant, the options narrowed to two: return home in shame or turn to prostitution. And up until 1860, it was entirely legal to beat your servants without any legal consequence. You could also compel them to attend church, where they sat in a segregated section at the back. The day after Christmas, servants received gifts from their employers, and this tradition became what is still known in Britain as Boxing Day, and one day of generosity to compensate for 364 days of near invisibility. Now picture yourself not as a servant, but as a guest, or even as a member of the family. Surely that was the good life. The candlelit dinners, the shooting parties, the silk dresses and champagne. And yes, parts of it were spectacular, at least on the surface. But the surface itself was trying to kill you. Let's talk about the walls. By the mid-Victorian era, wallpaper was cheap and everywhere. Over 32 million rolls were produced every year by 1874, with the cheapest papers selling for as little as a penny a roll. The most fashionable color was a vivid, striking green, created using a pigment called Scheele's green, invented by a Swedish chemist named Carl Scheele. The color was gorgeous. It was wildly popular with the pre-Raphaelite movement and home decorators across every class. It contained copper arsenite, which is to say, it contained arsenic. In 1858, one manufacturer estimated that 100 million square miles of arsenic-colored wallpaper hung on the walls of British homes. Another vendor admitted to using up to 2 tons of Scheele's green per week to produce his Christmas green wallpapers. The initial medical reports of wallpaper poisoning appeared in the late 1850s. A Birmingham physician named William Hines described suffering from abdominal cramps and lightheadedness triggered by the green wallpapers in his own study, while 2 of his patients reported sore throats, weakness, and inflamed eyes that mysteriously vanished every time they left their homes for a seaside holiday, and returned every time they came back. In 1862, the problem became impossible to ignore. 4 young siblings in the Limehouse district of London's East End died after sharing a bedroom decorated with Scheele's green wallpaper. They had torn strips off the wall and licked the green off the surface. The public outcry was enormous, and yet the wallpaper industry barely flinched. William Morris, one of the foremost designers in England, and a man whose wallpapers decorated some of the finest homes in the country, did not believe arsenic was dangerous. In 1885, he wrote to his friend Thomas Wardle, "As to the arsenic scare, that's a greater folly it is hardly possible to imagine. The doctors were bitten, as people were bitten by the witch fever." Morris dismissed the entire medical establishment as hysterical. It is worth mentioning that Morris's own family had financial ties to arsenic mining operations, which may have influenced his objectivity. He did eventually bow to public pressure in the 1870s and began producing arsenic-free wallpapers through Jeffrey & Co. But his personal conviction that doctors had invented the entire scare remained unshaken. Dr. Thomas Orton nursed a family through a mysterious illness that killed all 4 of their children. He tested the water. He inspected the home for filth. Everything came back clean. The only thing that unsettled him was the green wallpaper in the children's bedroom. Surgeon Robert Brudenell Carter went further, stating publicly that he believed 2 of his own children had died from arsenical wallpaper in their nursery. In Birmingham, a couple and their pet parrot all fell ill within a week of each other, and all 3 recovered after the green wallpaper was stripped from their walls. Even Queen Victoria was not immune. Mysterious illnesses at her own Osborne house were connected to William Morris's vivid arsenic-packed wallpapers, and in 1879 she reportedly ordered all the green wallpaper torn down in Buckingham Palace after a visiting dignitary became sick during his stay. The science that finally explained how wallpaper could kill you without being eaten did not arrive until 1891, but when Italian chemist Bartolomeo Gossio proved that it was the combination of arsenic in the pigments and fungi growing in the wallpaper paste that produced a toxic gas. For decades, the wallpaper in your bedroom had been slowly gassing you while you slept, and nobody understood why. And arsenic was not just on your walls. Every Victorian home kept arsenic powder around for rats and mice. People simultaneously applied arsenic cosmetics to their faces, gave their children toys painted with arsenic, wore dresses dyed with arsenic, and preserved their meat by dipping it in arsenic to keep away flies. Some upper-class women deliberately ate arsenic mixed with vinegar and chalk to achieve the fashionable, deathly pale complexion that high society demanded. In one factory employing 100 girls making artificial flowers dyed green, 26 showed symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning. One died after months of suffering from ulceration, and only 4 appeared to have no symptoms at all. A member of Parliament spent months confined to his home by a painful eruption on his feet. The cause was eventually traced to his fashionable green socks. He recovered quickly once he stopped wearing them. In 1837 alone, 506 deaths from inadvertent arsenic consumption were reported, and it was not until 1851 that customers were even required to sign a register when purchasing arsenic, or that selling it to children was prohibited. But we are still only halfway through the dangers inside your own home. And if you think the wallpaper was bad, wait until you hear about the lighting, the bathing, the fashion, and what happened when you sat down to play cards. Oh, trust me, you want to stay for what comes next. The gas that lit your home was trying to kill you too. Victorian coal gas contained what one source described as a lethal combination of hydrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, and sulfur. Any building with poor ventilation ran the risk of carbon monoxide suffocation. By 1880, gas lighting was actually cheaper than candles, but many of the grandest homes deliberately chose to use candles exclusively because wealthy homeowners wanted to demonstrate they could afford the more expensive option, spending more money on worse lighting to prove you had money to waste. That was status in Victorian England. For the servants, candles represented something else entirely. They were forbidden from having candles in their bedrooms, both for fire safety and, more revealingly, to discourage them from reading. To light their way to bed, servants stole stub ends of used candles, and competition for these stubs was fierce among butlers and footmen, who often regarded them as a legitimate perk to be sold to local merchants. To give you a sense of just how dark their world was, the light from a single modern 60-watt bulb is roughly equivalent to 74 candles burning at once. Victorian rooms lit by candles were extraordinarily dim by any standard we would recognize today. Cragside in Northumberland became the first house in the world to be lit by hydroelectric power, and the Prince of Wales himself visited to see what newspapers called the palace of a modern magician. The royal family had electricity installed in Buckingham Palace, starting with the ballroom in 1883, with the rest of its palace electrified by 1887. But for most of the country, and for most of the 1880s, you lived by candlelight and gaslight, and you breathed whatever those sources put into the air around you. Now consider what you were wearing while you breathed that air, because Victorian fashion was its own category of hazard. Death from burns was a significant cause of mortality among Victorian women, driven by the combination of open-hearth cooking, fashions that emphasized enormous skirts, and the use of highly flammable fabrics. Several women died when their full skirts caught fire from a hearth or a candle. The clothes themselves were an engineering project of almost absurd complexity. It was not uncommon for a wealthy Victorian woman to change her outfit 4 or 5 times a day. You began with a morning dress. You changed for a walk. You changed again for afternoon visitors. You changed for dinner. And you changed once more for evening occasions. Each outfit involved layers of undergarments, petticoats, and structural support that could take significant time and assistance to put on. The corset sits at the center of every modern person's horror at Victorian fashion, and the reality was complicated. Medical critics of the era warned that corsets were destroying women's bodies, but their criticism had little scientific backing. X-ray images did show that tightly laced corsets could change the shape of the rib cage, and they did cause organs to shift and affected digestion. But one study found that corseted women actually lived longer on average than women who did not wear corsets. And historians who have measured surviving 19th century corsets have determined that women probably did not cinch their waists below 20 inches, far from the 14-inch extremes reported in women's magazines of the time. The Rational Dress Society was founded in 1881 specifically to protest these restrictive clothing norms, pushing back against corsets, heavy fabrics, and dangerous petticoats, but their influence was limited. In 1883, the bustle returned to fashion in a dramatically exaggerated form, with steel strips attached to the insides of dresses to amplify the curve, jutting out at right angles from the back of the body. The new phantom bustle, patented in 1884, featured a pivot mechanism that allowed the steel wires to collapse when the wearer sat down and spring back up when she stood. But fashion had become a mechanical device you strapped to your body, and your beauty routine was no safer than your wardrobe. Victorian aristocrats brushed their teeth with a paste made from chalk dust, soot, and cuttlefish powder. Professional dentists were so rare that people seeking help with their teeth often turned to barbers or blacksmiths for extractions. Noble women washed their hair by cracking raw eggs directly onto their heads, and when egg supplies ran low, they substituted vinegar, rum, or black tea. Some Victorian medical theories held that frequent bathing weakened the bodily constitution and could actually cause illness, which resulted in some members of the nobility going months without bathing. They relied on perfumes to mask the inevitable consequences. Few private houses, even among the aristocracy, possessed anything resembling a dedicated bathroom. The wealthy gathered at Turkish baths or spas, but the evidence suggests they did more socializing than actual bathing. The first toilet paper squares were not sold until the 1870s, and the toilet paper roll itself was not invented until 1891. Before that, people used old newspaper or corn cobs. The mental image of a duchess in a silk gown using a corn cob is one I will leave you to sit with on your own. Before the age of hot water bottles, servants warmed sand in large pots and distributed it into sacks to place in their beds for warmth. Carpets, without the benefit of vacuum cleaners, were cleaned by spreading damp tea leaves across the surface and sweeping with a stiff brush. Laundry for even a modest estate was a 7-day process. Soaking on Monday, scrubbing on Tuesday, hanging on Wednesday, starching and ironing on Thursday and Friday, and folding on Saturday. The laundress involved in this process carried 150 pounds or more of washing, filled boilers requiring 20 or more gallons of water, plus another 10 gallons for scrubbing and rinsing, built and maintained fires to heat that water, and walked miles hauling water in buckets. All of that happened before the actual washing began. But for all its physical brutality and chemical dangers, the thing that made the Victorian manor truly unlivable for a modern person was not the labor or the arsenic or the flammable skirts. It was the social system, the invisible architecture of class and etiquette that governed every interaction, every glance, every word spoken or deliberately left unspoken. Consider what happened at Tranby Croft In September of 1890, Arthur Wilson, a 52-year-old Hull-based shipping magnate who had built his Yorkshire country house in 1876, hosted a house party. Among his guests was the Prince of Wales, who was a particular enthusiast of baccarat, an illegal card game. The prince carried his own set of counters on his person at all times, just in case an impromptu game materialized. During the evening's play, Sir William Gordon Cumming, a 42-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Scots Guards who had seen service in South Africa, Egypt, and Sudan, was accused by other guests of cheating. Gordon Cumming was described by his biographer as possibly the most handsome man in London, and certainly the rudest. He owned a house in Belgravia that he lent to the Prince of Wales for assignations with royal mistresses. None of that saved him. The accusation spiraled into a scandal that reached the courts and the newspapers. After the trial, a leader in the Times declared, "He has committed a mortal offence. Society can know him no more." Gordon Cumming was dismissed from the British Army. None of his close friends ever spoke to him again. His own barrister, Sir Edward Clarke, wrote in his memoirs almost 3 decades later, "I believe the verdict was wrong, and that Sir William Gordon Cumming was innocent." It did not matter. The social machinery had rendered its judgment, and there was no appeal. One evening of cards at a country house, one accusation from the right people, and a decorated military officer with decades of distinguished service ceased to exist in the eyes of his entire world. That was the system you lived under. Not written law, not courts or prisons. Social annihilation, delivered quietly over brandy and baccarat, with the Prince of Wales watching from across the table. The 1880s, it turns out, were the beginning of the end for all of it. Historian David Cannadine described the decade as the most troubled decade for the nobles and notables of Britain, no less than for the titled and territorial classes of Europe, since the 1840s or the 1790s. The export of cheap grain from the Americas and the arrival of refrigerated meat halved agricultural income in Britain. Britain's dependence on imported grain had risen from 2% in the 1830s to 45% in the 1880s, whilst with corn reaching 65%. The land that had been the foundation of aristocratic wealth for centuries was losing its value. Between 1809 and 1879, 88% of British millionaires had been landowners. Between 1880 and 1914, that figure collapsed to 33%. In 1882, Charles George Milnes Gaskell wrote that the vast increase in the carrying power of ships, the facilities of intercourse with foreign countries, the further cheapening of cereals and meat, meant that the old landed class were no longer lords of the earth. The servants, too, were beginning to push back. The 1880s saw the first attempts by butlers and maids to cast doubt on the Victorian obsession with hierarchy. New ideas about status and class were forming. The rigid system that had kept millions of people silent, invisible, and on their knees was starting to develop cracks. The inclusion of servants' injuries in the Workmen's Compensation Act would not come until 1907, decades after countless servants had suffered crippling injuries with no legal recourse. But the pressure was building. The fall in nutritional standards between 1880 and 1900 was so severe that generations of working people were visibly shrinking. In 1883, the British infantry was forced to lower the minimum height for recruits from 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 3 inches, because they could no longer find enough young men who met the old standard. The empire that ruled a quarter of the globe could not adequately feed its own working population. So here is what your week in a Victorian manor would have actually looked like. If you arrived as a servant, and statistically that is the most likely scenario by a wide margin, your day started before 7 in the morning. You cleaned grates. You carried coal. You hauled water. You scrubbed floors on your knees until your joints swelled into a condition that carried your job title in its medical name. You were not allowed to speak unless spoken to, not allowed to laugh, not allowed to sing, and not allowed to be seen by the people whose lives you made possible. If you met them on the stairs, you turned your face to the wall. If you broke a plate, the cost came out of wages that already amounted to less than £1 a week. If you fell in love, you lost your job and your future. Your bedroom was in the attic, unheated, and lit by stolen candle stubs. You ate in the basement. You worked 6 days a week, 16 hours a day, turned with half of Sunday free to contemplate whether any of it was worth continuing. The documented schedule of one real butler in 1893 shows his day beginning before 7 in the morning, serving dinner at 7 in the evening, overseeing evening tea at 9:30, and locking up the house and putting out the fire at 1 in the morning. That was a normal day. If you arrived as a guest, or better yet, as a member of the family, you lived in extraordinary comfort, surrounded by beauty and wealth and silence. 14-course dinners, shooting parties, the finest fabrics and furnishings money could buy. But the wallpaper in your bedroom was slowly releasing arsenic gas as fungi digested the paste behind the pattern. The gas lighting was filling your rooms with carbon monoxide. Your cosmetics contained poison. Your green socks could give you a skin condition severe enough to confine you to the house for months. Your toothpaste was made from soot and cuttlefish. You washed your hair with raw eggs. You might go months without a proper bath, masking the result with perfume. Your dress could catch fire and kill you. And at dinner, one wrong word, one accusation from a fellow guest could erase you from polite society so completely that even your closest friends would pretend they had never known you. The 6th Marquess of Bath, recalling his boyhood at Longley, said, "You were looked after in the lap of luxury." Even as a child, he had his own personal valet, one of 43 indoor servants. And he was right. It was luxury. But it was luxury built on a foundation of invisible labor, toxic materials, suffocating social rules, and the quiet understanding that everyone, from the Duchess to the scullery maid, occupied a fixed point in a system that would grind them down if they stepped out of line. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, sold 60,000 copies in its first year, and nearly 2 million by 1868. It has remained in continuous print ever since. Isabella Beeton herself, the woman who wrote the definitive guide to managing a household, died at 25 years old from an infection contracted during the birth of her 4th child. She documented the machinery of the Victorian home more completely than anyone before or since, and the machinery outlived her by decades. That is the world you would have walked into in 1880. A world of extraordinary surfaces and terrible foundations. And a world where the most dangerous things were the ones nobody talked about. The gas in the air, the poison on the walls, the rules no one wrote down but everyone enforced. You would not have lasted a week. And the most unsettling part is that the people who lived through it, the ones who spent their entire lives inside that system, did not think of it as survival at all. They called it normal.